So in this video, what we are going to be doing is we're going to see how a public lambda function can invoke a private lambda function. And what I mean by private is that both of these functions are going to be invoked through APIGateway URL endpoints. Okay, so let me just open up my APIGateway. And we have a couple of endpoints. We have this private endpoint and we have this public endpoint. Okay, the private is the database service. This is going to invoke this lambda function over here, the private database service. So the thing is, I don't want this lambda function to be accessible by the general public. I only want this to be invoked by the lambda functions. For example, whenever a user is trying to log in, they're gonna call this service, this lambda function. Since this is public, this user service is public, so they're going to invoke this lambda function through the use of APIGateway URL endpoints. Okay, and when they do that, this user service, it's going to communicate with database service, and it's maybe it's going to get back some response and do some things, you know, whatever it needs to do, and then it's gonna return a response back to the user. But if a user tries to access this lambda function, so this endpoint right here, so if they try to access that access the private database service lambda function, it's not gonna work. It's going to say that you need to be authorized. So that's what we're gonna be seeing. This video is going to serve as a future reminder to myself and as well as for other people who are struggling with the same issue, because I was having a bit of trouble finding you know, the right solution for this. Let's go to stages and let's open up our our private endpoint. So this is our private endpoint URL, and if I paste it in here and if I try to do a GET request, and as defined in here, we can do a GET request on this endpoint, and let's try to do that. You can see that it says that we are missing an authentication token, which is valid because we do not want the database service to be public, so a normal user cannot access this. For them to be able to access this, they will have to provide an authentication token, which is basically an IAM role. But if I try to access the user service, since this is public, let's try the post one. So if I try to access this, it's going to work. And this response, right, this response is coming from the private lambda function, which is our database service. So although we are not directly interacting with the private service, the user service is interacting with our private database service, and it's returning this string. So if I add some random text in here and deploy it, and then I try to call it again, it's gonna show us the updated response. So let's have a look at what are the things that we need to make sure that we set up for it to work properly. So for our public service, in our case the user service that's going to invoke our private service, we have to make sure that some of the things have to be configured properly. For example, the permission. The permission is very important because this is where this is the permission that's going to determine if you're going to be able to invoke the lambda function, the APIGateway endpoint or not. So let's have a look at our invoke lambda role that's attached to our public user service. If we have a look at this, we can see that we have only two policies. The first one is the basic lambda execution. This is attached by default to every lambda function role that you create by default. And the second one is the policy to allow the service, in our case the user service, to invoke APIGateway endpoint URLs. I'm giving it a full access, but you might want to change it depending on, you know, how much fine control you want your policies to have. So for me, I just set it to invoke full access, meaning that it can invoke any APIGateway request. So we need this because our user service is going to be invoking an API endpoint. Okay, and that's all you have to do, to be honest. And then for the API gateway request, whenever you set up your resources, for example the post, right, you need to make sure that your method request, right, the authorization is none for your public service. Well, this is gonna be none. Okay, but for when you create your private endpoint, you have to make sure that the authorization is set to AWS IAM. This is going to make sure that only an authorized IAM role with the right permission and roles and policies is going to be able to trigger this endpoint. Okay, so that's all the setup that you need to do when it comes to API gateway and user service. So now let's have a look at the user service code and how it is invoking the API gateway. So this is the code. At the very top, we have the URL that we want to invoke. This is the API gateway endpoint URL for the private function. Sorry, for the private lambda function. So if you go to stages and open up our private get request, this is exactly this. So this is the path to our endpoint for the private endpoint. So the first thing we do is we create a request object using the AWS request object, and we set the method to get, we set up our URL, and then we get the session credential. What this is doing is it's getting a temporary credential, and the credential is going to have all of the permissions and policies based on what role you attached to your service. So let's have a look at our user service. In our user service, we attached the invoke lambda role. So it's going to get a credential that's going to have all of the necessary permission that we set up right here. So since we set up API gateway invoke full access as well as API basic execution, this credential is going to have both of that permissions. After that, what we have to do is we have to sign a v4 auth. We have to create a signature that's going to be a v4 signature, and we are going to pass in our credential. This is going to be the service name. Okay, so if you were to be invoking a lambda, this would be lambda. But since we are invoking an API gateway endpoint, we have to set it as execute API. And this is the region where your endpoint is. So in our case, this is in Mumbai, that is AP South 1, so that's what we set here. And after that, we also have to add a authorization for our request, this one right here. Once we have that, we're going to use the request module to send the get request. So we pass in the URL, and then we also pass the header. This is very important because if you don't pass the header, it's not gonna work, because this is where all the authorization stuff is. And we then extract the response, we get the JSON, and that's basically what it does. Okay, and that's how it works. Now I want to show you what happens if we don't have the right roles. So let's say this role did not exist, right? So our user service, it only has this AWS lambda basic execution role. So it doesn't have the necessary permission to invoke a API gateway request. So if I do it, it's gonna say that user assumed role, and this is the name of the role that it has assumed. Okay, this is the role that it assumed, and that is the name of my role. It is not authorized to perform execute API. We are not allowed to perform this because we don't have the right permission. And yeah, that's it. That's all you have to know.